Hello again, class. We're going to continue our series of lectures on how the government actually functions on a day-to-day basis. And as I previewed at the end of our last lecture on political parties, today we're going to be talking about the government's role. And in a lot of ways, this takes us back to the very beginning of the year, because that was really, I believe, our very first lecture. What should a government do? What should it not do? All right, and so those are some of the questions we're going to focus on very specifically in connection with the U.S. government and with its structure in place and how it operates on a day-to-day basis. And these, ultimately, when people are having political arguments, a lot of times it comes down to their answers to these questions. How you answer these questions often at least, it affects on what side of a political argument you're going to be in. So the questions are, what should the government do? In what areas should it interfere? And in what areas should it not interfere? All right, we're seeing this very up close and personal now as I'm recording this on May 5th, 2020. And there's a constant debate as to how the government and the country should respond to the coronavirus pandemic. Obviously, some people are arguing that we need stricter shutdowns, that we all need a shelter in place until the number of people infected with the disease has gone down. Other people believe the government should open back up and people should be able to get back to work if that's what they choose. And where people are on that argument has a lot to do with how they think the government should operate, what it can and can't interfere with. So what should the government do? And as I just said, and it's your view on these questions will often affect what political party you're in. So it's not just answer particular issues. I use the coronavirus pandemic as an example. But the answer to these questions on basically every issue or most issues affecting political and civic life lead people to join one party versus the other, because people in a particular party tend to have the same answers on these questions, or at least similar answers as to other people within that party, and that's how they end up, within that party or not. Now, again, this is a review from our last lecture. In theory, Republicans claim to want a smaller, less intrusive government, and Democrats claim to want a more active government aimed at remedying society's ills. As we talked briefly on our previous lecture, political parties' views on these types of things change over time, and they may change from issue to issue at any one particular time. But in theory, and again, this is a gross, overly simplified generalization, but in theory, Republicans tend to push for a more smaller, less intrusive government, whereas Democrats really see the government should be aimed at solving problems that pop up in society. Now, I've said this lecture takes us full circle to the beginning of the year, so let's look at these quotes that we started off our year with. Remember, we quoted James Madison from the Federalist Papers. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. All right, so he's setting up the two problems as he sees it that he's going to end this quote with. All right, if people were perfect, you wouldn't have to have a government to try to control any of their actions. All right, no one would go around murdering or stealing or robbing or polluting or anything else that you may deem to be inappropriate or wrong. And the flip side, as Madison puts it, if angels were in charge of the government, then you wouldn't have to worry about putting controls on the government. Remember, our government, if you go back to the 7 principles, our government is to be a limited government. All right, we have a Bill of Rights. It was tacked onto the Constitution almost immediately. to protect people's individual rights, because our government is made up not of angels, but of people, and so they're not perfect. And that's what Madison says in his last sentence. You must first enable a government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. So in other words, probably a more simpler way to put that is the government has to be powerful enough to carry out its basic functions, but not so powerful that it deprives people of their rights. All right, so that's Madison's view on government. We also looked at Lincoln's view. Remember, and his was a little bit more pragmatic. All right, Madison's talking theoretical, angels and men and people, things like that. Lincoln's view is a little more pragmatic. He says, look, the government is to do for people what they can't do for themselves. But in all that people can individually do for themselves, government ought not to interfere. And a big question comes about is, okay, say you agree with Lincoln. The big question is, well, what can people do for themselves? What can they not do for themselves? All right, things have changed quite a bit since Lincoln gave this quote. All right, he was giving this quote before there were airports or national highway systems or things like that. Okay, we have, certain governmental organizations, the FAA, they have air traffic controllers, making sure two planes don't try to land at the same airport at the same time and crashing into each other and killing everybody on board those planes. The government takes that over because, well, that's something we need done, a community needs done. Now, I've heard it say that you could have a private company do that, but then, what happens if that company goes out of business at a particular airport, or someone calls in, goes on strike or something, And so the government does that for these communities. Another issue I think argued about today that really gets to the heart of Lincoln's quote, and again, you can agree with Lincoln's quote, but then come down on opposite sides of a particular issue. And I'm thinking here, healthcare. All right, some people think the government should provide basically health insurance in one form or another for all people, because that is something that people cannot necessarily do for themselves. All right, when Lincoln was alive, all right, each town may have a doctor that would make house calls, but it would be very cheap to pay that doctor. There weren't MRI machines or CAT scans. The doctor would just show up and like, no, looks like you're sick. Try taking some aspirin. All right, healthcare was pretty simple. It's gotten much, much, much more complex, and with its increased complexity, it's become much, much more expensive. So the argument is, well, can't people just get jobs and buy healthcare or health insurance from private healthcare companies like we've been doing for the last few decades? That is certainly one view. And so those people argue, well, individuals can do this thing for themselves, therefore government shouldn't do it. Others take the opposite view and say, no, that system is not working. There's millions and millions of people that aren't receiving health care through that system. So the government needs to step in and provide health care in these situations. So you can see both sides of that may read this Lincoln quote and say, okay, yes, that is the proper role of government. The devil's in the details, so to speak. The issue starts to become, okay, great, we all agree with Lincoln on this, and I'm not saying that every single person does, but most people probably generally agree with Lincoln here. But the issue, or whenever you have a particular issue, it's hard to come to a consensus as to whether, all right, does this fit into the category where people can't do it for themselves, or does this fit into the category that people can do for themselves? So against that background, let's look at what the government does. And you can see I've put on here on the left side of the screen, you have the executive branch. These are the various cabinet level departments. I'm not going to read through all these, but you have Secretary for Department of Treasury, Department of State, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Energy, of Education, et cetera, et cetera. On the right-hand side of the screen, these are the committees, or at least the largest committees in Congress. You have appropriations. That's basically deals with money. Ways and Means, another, talking about how you collect and spend money. The Energy Department, oversight. Transportation, Foreign Affairs, Homeland Security, Judiciary, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so when you see what departments the executive branch has and what departments or committees Congress has, and you see there's a lot of overlap. There's energy in both. There's Homeland Security in both. Transportation in both. There's a lot of overlap. You can kind of see at least what the federal government thinks its role should be in what departments and committees it has created. Now this graphic on the right, I believe I put up, I can't remember if I put up this exact same graphic or a very similar graphic at the very first of our semester. And as I believe I told you then, you don't have to take this for gospel. All right. This is one person or one group's interpretation of what the functions of government are. You can go to a different person who would have more boxes here. Other people would have fewer boxes. All right. So I don't put this graphic up to say, yes, these are the exact and only functions of a government, other than just give you an example of the different types of areas that some people think the government should play a role in. Now, much more broadly, government policy can be divided into two categories. First is domestic. Basically, that's domestic. When we talk about domestic, we're just talking about things here at home, things or issues involving within the United States itself. And then you have foreign policy, as the name suggests, or the title suggests. Those are issues concerning things in other countries, our relations with other countries. The rest of today's lecture, or at least this particular lecture, will focus on domestic policy, and then I'll later do a separate lecture on foreign policy. All right, so areas of domestic policy. And we're just going to go through these. Some I'll spend more time with, some I'll just mention in passing. But the first, let's talk about economic policy. Since at least the Great Depression, could be earlier than that, but since at least the Great Depression, an overwhelming majority of Americans believe that government should focus on helping the economy. Now, not all. I believe in our last lecture, I discussed libertarian policy, and I believe you may have some people say, no, the government should completely stay out of economic policy. And if things are going well, great. And if things are going poorly, oh, well, we'll just have to live through it and then we'll eventually get better again. But the government should never play any role. That's some view. Most Americans, and I'm talking even on Republicans and Democrats, most Americans believe the government should play some role in helping the economy. The disagreement is about how to help. Right? And you will see in every election, you're going to see the candidates get up and they're going to talk about how their policies will help with the economy. All right, again, the disagreement is about how. Should we lower taxes? That'll help in some ways. Or should the government spend money? And by spending money, that helps in other ways. So that's often the issue. For example, free trade or protective tariffs. And I discussed this in our previous lecture, how the policies or the parties' policies towards protective tariffs since between Reagan and Trump have somewhat evolved and changed over the years. But that's always that's always an issue. And quite frankly, that was one of the issues that created the first political parties. We also talked about that in our last lecture. Hamilton versus Jefferson. One of the things they disagreed with were, should you have protective tariffs to help grow American industries, or should you have free trade that helps people who make things in America and wants to sell them abroad? So this question has been around pretty much since George Washington was in office. All right. Other ways. Do you give tax breaks or subsidies? Subsidies is basically kind of where you pay a business or funnel money towards a particular activity. Uh, should you do that? Should you give breaks for tax breaks for businesses? The idea there being, well, if businesses don't have to pay such high taxes, if they have more money left over at the end of the day, then they'll go out and hire more workers, they'll expand their business, and that grows the economy, provides jobs, etc. Uh, Other issues are, should you give tax cuts for individuals? Not businesses, but individuals. The idea there, sort of along the same way. If when people get their paycheck, if they have less money taken out, they have more money at the end of the day, then they're more apt to go to the store and buy things. And when you buy things at a store, that money goes to the company, and then the company wants to expand and get more workers, et cetera, et cetera. So these are issues. This isn't an economics class, so we're not going to go into the pros and cons of these and the potential fallacies and downfalls of all that. But I'm just saying these are areas in which even people who believe that the government should play some role in helping the economy, this is they disagree on the how, and these are some of the ways they disagree. Also, since the Great Depression, the government has provided some sort of safety net for individuals. Now, you probably have a little bit more disagreement as to whether the government should provide a safety net. But I do believe probably the vast majority believe there should be some type of safety net. The safety net takes the advantage of protection, or takes the form of, protection for workers. These are wage and hour laws. Workers can't work more than 40 hours a week, or if they do, they have to get paid time and a half. Various other labor laws, OSHA, that's the Occupational Safety and Hazard Association. I believe the A stands for association. And they set safety rules. If you work on a construction site, you will be very familiar with OSHA safety rules. Those are the ones that say, okay, you have to have a hard hat, like the people in this picture do. You have to wear safety goggles in certain areas. If you're working up high, you have to have fall protection. OSHA sets rules to help protect people. The idea being, well, that way businesses can't force their employees to do dangerous activities. And force their employees, they say, look, if you don't do this dangerous activity, we're going to fire you. OSHA provides those types of protections. And again, people can argue whether OSHA's rules are too stringent or not stringent enough, but that's one of the roles that the government does play. Unemployment benefits. We've heard a lot about these since the pandemic started, because so many people can't go to work. We've had a record number of people applying for unemployment benefits, and that's simply where the government provides a portion of people's, in effect, their salary. They make up for their lost salary. The government simply just pays money to people who have lost their job. And here are the big ones in terms of dollars spent. Social Security, that's for both retirement and disability. For those of you who've started working, that's that little box that says FICA on your paycheck, and you have to give a percentage, all right, between about 7 and 8% of every paycheck goes for Social Security, and your employer pays that same amount. And the idea is, while you're working, you pay into Social Security, and then once people retire, once they reach a certain age, and that age is somewhat of a moving target, it's changed over the years, but it's typically been in your mid-60s. Once you receive a certain age, the government, in effect, basically pays you every month a certain amount of money, again, to sort of replace the salary you lost by retiring. That's the idea. That also happens if someone becomes disabled and can't work. Medicare is basically like health insurance for senior citizens. Medicaid is health insurance for people who can't, maybe not necessarily afford medical procedures or health insurance in the private market. Now, these are very, very controversial because they make up a huge portion of the government's expenditures. I believe somewhere between 20 and 25% of government spending is on Medicare and Medicaid. All right, so basically for every dollar the government takes in, they spend between 20 and 25 cents of it on Medicare and Medicaid. And they spend roughly that same amount on the military, which we'll talk about here later, but those are the two big ones. Back to domestic policy though. Other assistance programs, WIC, that's Women, Infant, Child, SNAP, which basically helps provide food for people who can't otherwise buy food on their own. So you have various other assistance programs, and this is all part of the safety net. And this is more controversial because all politicians say that my policies are going to help the economy. There are probably more people who don't believe, or at least don't believe in the ways the government provides the safety net. You have more of an argument on these than just the general idea that the government should help the economy. Because one way the government, in theory, can help the economy, at least according to some people, is just by getting out of the way. And so people who think the government should help the economy, part of what they're thinking is, well, just getting out of the way helps the economy. And so that's therefore is why I believe you have more people willing to say, okay, yes, that is part of the government's role, even if they participate in that role by being inactive. Whereas safety net, the government has to be active in providing a safety net, so you get a little bit more pushback here, is my thinking. All right, national security, protecting the nation from external and internal threats. Now, I'm not sure you can find anyone who's not going to think that part of a government's role is to protect its citizens. All right, that goes back to Madison's quote, men were angels, no government would be necessary. All right, but people aren't angels. We know, there are criminals. We know there are threats from foreign countries from time to time. And so everybody believes that, okay, if your country is being threatened, if your citizens are being threatened, whether it's by fellow citizens or by foreign countries, part of the government's role is to protect those citizens. Again, the controversy is about how and at what cost. All right, so the United States and state governments conduct the security in numerous ways. One, you have local police forces. All right, those are going to be what most people see on a day-to-day basis, just your local police officers. But you also have the FBI, the CIA, Homeland Security, NSA, which is the National Security Administration, I believe, the TSA. Those are the people at the airports making you walk through medical detectors and scanners and x-raying your bags and things like that. And finally, you have the military. Now, we're lucky in America in the sense that the military has always been about protecting from abroad. Certainly throughout history, you've had tyrants and despots use the military against their own people. But in America, the military is more of a really kind of a foreign policy arm. I included it in this area because certainly national security is part of the government's role, and the military plays a big part of that. But it's really more of a foreign policy issue in America because our military really deals with foreign threats, not internal threats. That's more of a police officer, FBI job. All right, perhaps the most controversial area is social policy. And social policy, that's a pretty broad, open-ended word. It can mean a lot of things. But some of the areas that we think about when we talk about social policy, regulating marriage, i.e., the most controversial marriage-related issue right now is probably gay marriage. All right, that's a big area of social policy. Laws regarding abortion, gun regulations. All right, so you can see these are very, very controversial issues that can be very divisive, and so probably the biggest arguments people are going to have about government's role in domestic policy are going to be on these social policy issues, because these are people that think about on a very personal level. Yes, if a government policy is affecting someone's pocketbook, their money, how much taxes they pay, or their job, people are going to take that very seriously also. But on social policy, those are really their beliefs are really kind of fundamental to people. And so they get, these issues can be very, very divisive and controversial. If you look at the chart I showed on the right, really there's three charts. You can see how people, and this chart isn't necessarily about social policy. It can be about economic policy as well, foreign policy issues, everything. But I put it here just to show you kind of what's been happening in our country over the past 25 years or so. And so those vertical white or gray lines there, those show where basically your average Democrat or average Republican were on conservative and liberal issues back in 1994. And as you can see, there really wasn't much difference. Skip ahead to 2004, and this is in y'all's lifetime. Look at 2004, again, not much difference. There looks like the gap is widening a little bit, probably not too much. Then you go into 2014, and that gap's getting much and much bigger. All right, so people are now, at least according to this research poll, and just sort of how the country feels, people seem to be much more divided now than they used to be, where their ideas used to overlap quite a bit. Now they're becoming more and more extreme vis-a-vis each other's opinions. And there are probably a lot of issues of that. My personal theory is, I think social media has a lot to do with this. That now people have social media, and they really only a lot of times get their information or their views on things from similar people on social media. They basically block out all other information unless it's coming just from a source that they already tend to agree with on certain things. And so people kind of are breaking off into these social media camps and who they follow on social media, and they only follow people that think just like they do, and so it's driving them further and further apart. Again, there's probably multiple reasons why people are becoming more divisive, at least according to this poll. I'm just throwing out one that I think may be a cause. You may be able to think about other potential reasons. And I'm not at all saying that my cause or my theory is even right, is the primary cause. I'm just saying I think it could be one cause. But again, it's up for interpretation. So, I want you, even if you hit pause right now or think about it after you finish the video, kind of think about your other reasons. Why do you think this gap is happening? Or do you think this gap is happening? Do you agree with this chart? These are areas that I want you to focus on what you believe and why you believe it, and how you think these issues are or are not becoming more divisive. Another area of domestic policy is immigration, controlling who can and can't enter the country and who can and can't become a citizen. Now, first of all, let's talk about federalism here for a minute. Pretty much everything else I've talked about to now is a joint local / state government and a federal government issue. All right. So in other words, even talking about national security, well, states have their local police forces, where the federal government has the FBI and CIA and military. Certainly economic policies. The federal government has tax policies, but each state has their own tax policies. Okay. So all of the issues we've talked about now have been a combination between state governments and federal governments. After all, that's how our federalist system is designed. There's an overlap in the responsibilities and powers of the state governments and federal government. Immigration is an exception to that, though. It is purely a federal government issue. We have 50 states. We do not have 50 different immigration policies. That is purely something done at the national level. And part of the reason is because, well, we are, in fact, a united country. The Constitution says states cannot prevent people from other states from going in and out of those states. And so once someone comes into the country, whether they come in through Texas or New York or California or Florida, they're then free to travel throughout the rest of the country freely. And so you really couldn't have a system where 50 different states had 50 different immigration policies. This is one of those issues that really has to be dealt with solely at the national level. And you see on this chart, I have why this is such an important issue in America, because those are the 15 countries with the most immigrants. And as you can see, America has many, many more immigrants than any other country. Now, keep in mind though, the United States, I think, is the third most populous country in the world. Only China and India have more people in the United States. And so simply saying that there's more immigrants in the USA in a vacuum doesn't tell the whole story, because you have to view these things in terms of percentage of population. So although America has many, many more immigrants than any other country, as a percentage of its population, it's not always bigger. For instance, the United States right there, immigrants make up 15% of the US population. But if you look down that chart of numbers, or that list of numbers on the very right of the column, Saudi Arabia is at 34%. United Arab Emirates is at 87.3%. So think about that. Let me, if I can convert that to a fraction real quick, that's probably about 7/8. So if you have 8 people in the United Arab Emirates, 7 of them are going to be immigrants. That's obviously a much, much higher percentage than the United States, but it's also a much smaller country, so the total overall number of immigrants is smaller than the U.S. So the point is that this is a big issue in the U.S. because of our size and because of the total number of immigrants that are living in the U.S. The other areas of domestic policy, I'm going to discuss these all pretty quickly. Energy policy, as you see, I've included a picture of windmills here, oil wells there. And so a lot of energy policy is, where do you want to focus your energy production? Do you want to try to promote coal production? Do you want to try to promote sustainable energy, solar power, or wind power? Do you want to stay with the oil well model? And it's really a mix. We have all of those sources of energy here in the U.S. Agriculture policy. Again, what do you want to promote? Do you want to try to help farmers out when they have issues? Do you want to encourage them to grow certain types of crops, that sort of thing? Transportation policy, that's the picture I put on the bottom right corner, is a markup of, I believe, LaGuardia Airport in New York, or at least a proposal of how they're going to update it. And if you've never been through LaGuardia Airport, then you probably don't understand how badly it needs to be updated. That's just a little personal aside, but boy, for the biggest city in the country and one of the biggest cities in the world, you'd think they'd have a nicer airport, but they really don't. Anyway, getting back to the lecture, environmental policy, and I put these in this particular order because you can see how they all overlap. Obviously, your energy policy affects your environmental policy. If you're going to focus on coal power or even oil and gas, that's going to have a particular effect on the environment, or a different effect than, say, focusing on wind or solar power will have. Same thing with transportation. Are you going to build more highways? Are you going to try to build light rail systems, more mass transit? So this is, all of these overlap and they're interconnected. And you can see how tensions can rise. For instance, if you're working in the Department of Energy, your goal may be to make sure America has, all the energy it could ever possibly need. But if you're working at the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, you may be more worried about the effects producing energy has on the environment. So you have these different policies and different agencies, and their goals are not always the same. Healthcare policy, we've talked about that before. We talked a lot about that at the first of this lecture. Does the government provide health insurance? Do people need to go out and get it on their own? That sort of thing. You're also seeing that a lot now with the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's why I included this picture down here on the left right here. That is someone, a healthcare worker screening someone, I think giving a coronavirus test, I believe. All right, finally, education. And now education, probably more so done at the state level than the national government, but the national government definitely gets involved. Housing and urban development, that's just building housing and building cities and developing communities, that sort of thing. And finally, I just threw in space exploration, groups like NASA. Now, my question is this domestic policy? Is it foreign policy? I mean, obviously Mars isn't really a foreign country, or putting a satellite up in the orbit isn't within the boundaries of the United States, but it does have a domestic effect, possibly, certainly with the information we learned from exploration. So I didn't really know, is that domestic policy or foreign policy? I'll let you decide how you view that, but that is a potential area of government's role. All right, on our next lecture, we will talk about areas of foreign policy.